In today's video, we're diving into the 1960s and 1970s. This was a time of cultural revolution and political rebellion, but also of conservative revival and silent resistance. Young Americans were no longer content to be passive observers. Some formed radical protest movements demanding sweeping changes to the political system, social norms, and even U.S. foreign policy. Others rallied behind traditional values, national pride, and a belief in law and order. We'll explore the rise of both the New Left and the Young Americans for Freedom, the emergence of the counterculture, the impact of the sexual revolution, and the firestorm of protest against the Vietnam War. And we'll also hear from the other side of the generation, the so-called silent majority, who watched these upheavals unfold with growing unease. This is the story of a generation divided, a country in conflict, and a cultural legacy that still echoes today. Let's get started. In the early 1960s, a new spirit of activism began to stir among America's college and university students. It was a spirit of rebellion against what they saw as a rigid and outdated authority structure on campus, in politics, and in society at large. The first real stirrings came in 1962 when a group of radical students formed an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, and met in Port Huron, Michigan. Under the leadership of Tom Hayden, SDS issued the Port Huron Statement, a bold declaration calling for participatory democracy, in which students would have a say in decisions that affected their lives. Supporters of Hayden's ideas came to be known as the New Left, a movement distinct from the old labor focused left of the early 20th century. These were young, educated activists pushing for a new form of political engagement. The movement gained momentum in 1964 when the free speech movement erupted on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. Students protested against university restrictions on political activity, demanding the right to speak freely and to organize. Soon, campuses across the country were alive with protests, not just over free speech, but also against strict university rules, on dormitory visits, drinking, and the governance of academic institutions. As the Vietnam War escalated, the protests intensified. By the mid 1960s, hundreds of colleges were caught up in anti war demonstrations, some shutting down entirely. A radical faction of SDS, known as the Weathermen, took the movement to an extreme, embracing violence and vandalism in their attacks on American institutions. While they represented only a fringe element, their actions cast a shadow over the New Left and discredited much of its early idealism in the public eye. Alongside political activism, a powerful counterculture took root. This was a cultural revolution as much as it was a political one, driven by young people who rejected conventional norms and embraced new ways of living. The so called hippies and flower children were its most visible symbols, young men and women who wore long hair, beads, beards, and jeans, and who experimented with alternative lifestyles, including communal living and psychedelic drugs. Music played a huge role in giving voice to this movement. Artists like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan expressed the angst and hope of a generation through folk protest songs, while the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jim Morrison, and Janis Joplin provided the emotional pulse through rock music. The high point of this cultural explosion was the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969, where thousands of young people gathered in New York for 3 days of music, peace, and protest. But the counterculture also had a darker side. Some young people destroyed their lives experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like LSD or became addicted to harder substances. As the idealism faded and economic uncertainty set in, the counterculture unraveled in the 1970s. A more lasting aspect of the 1960s cultural transformation was the sexual revolution, a broad shift in American attitudes towards sex and morality. Much of the groundwork had been laid earlier by the controversial studies of Alfred Kinsey in the late 1940s and 1950s. His research shocked the public by showing that premarital sex, marital infidelity, and homosexuality were more common than most Americans had believed. In the 1960s, new medical and technological developments fueled this change. Antibiotics made it easier to treat venereal diseases, and the birth control pill introduced in 1960 gave women more control over their reproductive choices. At the same time, media and advertising openly featured sexual themes, making sex seem like just another product in the consumer marketplace. While it's debatable how deeply this revolution changed mainstream behavior, there's no question that premarital sex, contraception, abortion, and homosexuality became more openly discussed and practiced. By the 1980s, however, there was a conservative backlash. Many Americans blamed the sexual revolution for a rise in illegitimate births, rape, sexual abuse, and the spread of devastating new illnesses like AIDS. Perhaps no issue galvanized the youth movement and the counterculture more than the Vietnam War. By late 1965, opposition to the war was growing. In Congress, lawmakers split into two groups: the Hawks, who wanted to escalate the war, and the Doves, who demanded withdrawal. Massive anti war marches were held. The first major one happened in Washington, D.C. in 1965. And by 1967, 300,000 Americans marched in New York City. That same year, 50,000 demonstrators tried to shut down the Pentagon. Universities became hotbeds of resistance. The Berkeley campus, once again, led the charge. Teach-ins, gatherings with speakers and study sessions, became a new norm of protest. Most advocated for immediate withdrawal. The SDS led the way, organizing sit ins, draft card burnings, and demonstrations. Though it eventually splintered in 1969, its influence lasted well into the 1970s. As the war dragged on, resistance deepened. In 1967, boxing champion Muhammad Ali made headlines when he refused to be drafted, citing religious beliefs. He was convicted of draft evasion but remained free on appeal until the Supreme Court overturned his case in 1971. By 1968, an estimated 10,000 draft resistors had fled the United States, many crossing into Canada to avoid service. The draft caused deep rifts among America's youth. Those from wealthier backgrounds often secured college deferments, while many minorities who could not afford college were sent to fight. This raised serious questions of fairness, race, and class that added fuel to the anti war fire. Amid the rise of progressive and radical activism in the early 1960s, not all young people joined the rebellion against tradition. In fact, many students stood firmly in defense of conservative values, forming a group of their own, the Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF. Founded in 1960 at the estate of conservative publisher William F. Buckley Jr., YAF brought together young conservatives who were deeply committed to anti communism, free market economics, limited government, and traditional morality. The group issued the Sharon Statement, a foundational document that outlined their beliefs in personal freedom, the Constitution, and the fight against tyranny abroad, especially in the form of Soviet communism. While the New Left championed protest and reform, YAF supported patriotism, the Cold War census, and often backed the U.S. government's efforts in Vietnam. They campaigned vigorously for Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election and became a key force in the emergence of the modern conservative movement. YAF members clashed regularly with New Left activists on college campuses, creating an ideological divide that mirrored the generational and political rift sweeping across the nation. While college campuses, protest marches, and media coverage spotlighted a growing anti war sentiment, millions of Americans watched these events with concern and often with quiet disapproval. These Americans were part of what President Richard Nixon famously called the silent majority. In a nationally televised address on November 3rd, 1969, Nixon appealed directly to this group. He described them as patriotic, law abiding citizens who supported American troops, trusted their government, and rejected the radicalism and chaos that seemed to dominate headlines. The silent majority included suburban families, blue collar workers, veterans, and many in the middle class who were deeply uncomfortable with the violence of protest movements, the rise of counterculture, and the declining respect for authority. Many of them saw student protesters not as courageous truth tellers, but as ungrateful or disruptive. This group was largely supportive of the Vietnam War, or at least wanted to see it end with American honor preserved. They often aligned with conservative values, and their quiet support gave Nixon the political capital to continue his strategy of Vietnamization, gradually turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing U.S. troops. The idea of the silent majority became a powerful rhetorical tool, not just for Nixon, but for future political leaders who wanted to mobilize mainstream America against what they framed as elite, liberal, or out of touch forces. In many ways, the silent majority was a precursor to the conservative populist movements that would grow in influence throughout the 1970s and beyond. Their silence didn't mean indifference. It meant they expressed their views not in the streets, but at the ballot box. The 1960s and 1970s were decades of clashing visions for America's future. Some young people marched, protested, dropped out, or burned draft cards. Others joined conservative groups, enlisted in the military, or quietly cast votes for law and order. From the Young Americans for Freedom to the New Left, from Woodstock to Berkeley, and from anti war demonstrators in the streets to the silent majority at home. This era revealed a deeply divided but passionately engaged nation. It was a time of turbulence when Americans, especially the youth, challenged everything from the Vietnam War to gender roles, from university rules to moral norms. Some sought radical change, others fought to preserve tradition, and most were caught somewhere in between. What emerged from that chaos was a new kind of political and cultural awareness, one that would shape debates about patriotism, freedom, morality, and identity for decades to come. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.